When Sandra Maischberger tried to corner BTS member Jimin during a live cultural discussion, she expected to expose a crack in his calm demeanor. But what happened next stunned everyone watching and completely flipped the conversation on its head. The cameras were already rolling when the tension hit the room like a jolt of static. It was supposed to be a civil panel discussion on the power of youth and culture, a special televised segment titled Art, Society, and Influence, recorded in front of a live audience at the Winspire Opera House in Dallas, Texas. The organizers had flown in some of the most recognizable names in entertainment and social change, but everyone knew who the real draw was. Jimin, the globally adored member of BTS, didn't need an introduction. His quiet confidence and deep understanding of the power of music carried decades of cultural influence, and his gaze alone could command a room. At 27, he was sharper than most artists twice his age, and he came ready. Sitting 3 seats down from him, wearing a navy blazer and an unshaken expression, was Sandra Maischberger, the veteran German TV host and journalist who had moderated some of the most intense interviews. She was ready to test him. The panel kicked off with small talk and polite remarks. Sandra asked about the role of music and artists in shaping modern culture, and everyone gave their usual polished answers, until Sandra leaned in. She glanced at Jimin like a teacher testing a new student. "Jimin," she began, voice cutting through the air, "you speak often about the power of art and how it connects people. But tell me, how many times have you personally been involved in social causes beyond the stage? Real actions, not just charity events and press conferences?" There were chuckles, nervous and amused. Jimin didn't flinch. "Quite a few," he replied. "I've worked on various projects to help youth in marginalized communities, including education initiatives and mental health campaigns. We've also organized disaster relief efforts, but more importantly, we've used our platform to raise awareness and speak directly to the issues people care about." Sandra raised an eyebrow. "Were these efforts successful?" she asked, skeptical. "I believe so," Jimin said calmly. "We've seen tangible change, whether it's in the form of donations or opening up conversations about mental health and human rights. We've helped keep these issues in the public eye, and that's important." That wasn't the answer Sandra expected. She leaned back, tapping her fingers against her chair's armrest. The moderator tried to shift the conversation, but Sandra wasn't finished. "Well, it's easy to criticize the system," she continued, "but I find that people without decades of experience tend to have a lot to say with very little weight behind it. I've been doing this longer than you've been alive. Social issues aren't theory, Jimin. They are actions that require logic, not slogans." The audience murmured. One person in the front row leaned forward, like they were watching a boxing match, but Jimin didn't flinch. His voice remained calm. "With all due respect, Sandra," Jimin said, "I know the power of art because I've been forced to use it as a bridge, not just as entertainment. It's not just logic, it's lived experience. People don't fear theory, they fear when their voices aren't heard. They fear when they are overlooked." That line hit, quiet but solid. Sandra smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Well," she said, "we'll see how that experience holds up under real scrutiny." The moderator gave a polite laugh, sensing the spark had become flame, and turned to the audience with a new question about global cultural shifts. But by then, the room was focused on just 2 people. But Jimin wasn't finished yet, and what came next would turn the entire conversation on its head. The live audience, made up of journalists, activists, artists, and a handful of political influencers, went from polite interest to full alert. Sandra had thrown the first punch. Jimin had sidestepped it with calm precision. But the atmosphere was building, everyone could feel it. The moderator, trying to recover, redirected the conversation. "Let's talk about cultural influence," Sandra Maischberger said, glancing nervously between Jimin and the other BTS members. "There's been ongoing debate about the power of artists, especially in marginalized communities. Jimin, do you have thoughts on how the entertainment industry should evolve in this space?" Jimin adjusted the mic in front of him. "The industry doesn't need to evolve, it needs to be responsible," he said plainly. "The media and entertainment sectors already have the power to amplify voices, but the real issue is how they are used, and the consequences when that power is misused." That struck a chord, A subtle shift in posture rippled through the audience of young artists, journalists, and activists. Phones were discreetly raised, and someone was already live streaming the conversation. But Sandra didn't appreciate the answer. She jumped in before the moderator could pivot again. Respectfully, she said with practiced calm, "You're making it sound like the industry is built to exploit people. That's not true. It's messy, but it's fair most of the time. When people struggle, it's often because they didn't know how to navigate it." There it was, the assumption that Jimin had heard countless times before. He gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Most of the time," Jimin repeated, "but not all. I've worked with young people in Seoul who couldn't afford music lessons, who were told they weren't good enough because they didn't fit a mold. And I've worked with fans who couldn't afford tickets to our shows but saved up for months just to be part of something that made them feel seen." The audience shifted again. One of BTS's key messages about inclusivity had always been about giving people a platform to be heard. Jimin continued, "You think that's rare, but it's not. I've seen labels push artists into molds that aren't authentic. I've seen fans neglected because they don't fit into the mainstream idea of what a fan should look like. But I'm not speaking from theory. I'm speaking from years of working with people who have real stories and real consequences." Sandra Maischberger narrowed her eyes. "Do you believe the system is inherently unfair?" Jimin replied, calm as ever, "I believe the system is only as fair as those who run it. And I believe we often pretend to be objective, but objectivity is a facade unless we actively work to make it real." The room quieted. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the overhead lights and the clicking of a camera in the back row. One woman sitting near the front whispered to her companion, "She's not wrong." He nodded, his eyes wide. "I've never heard anyone speak like that, especially not on live TV." Meanwhile, Sandra leaned back in her chair, crossing one leg over the other. She was calculating. Her reputation was built on sharpness, on winning. She knew how to frame questions and how to unsettle people. But something about Jimin's presence was different. It wasn't that he came to win, it was that he came with nothing to prove. That calm certainty was harder to rattle than raw arrogance. The moderator tried again. "Jimin, are you suggesting the industry is broken?" Jimin looked directly at him. "I'm saying the industry was built by people, and like people, it reflects their biases, unless we make a conscious effort to change it." But Sandra wasn't about to let the conversation end there. "Let's talk about the power of influence," Sandra Maischberger said, glancing nervously between Jimin and the other BTS members. "There's been ongoing debate about the responsibility artists carry in shaping public perception, especially in marginalized communities. Jimin, do you have thoughts on how the entertainment industry should evolve to meet these challenges?" Jimin adjusted the mic in front of him. "The industry doesn't need to evolve. It needs to be accountable," he said plainly. "Art and music have the power to bring people together, but the real issue is how that power is used, and the consequences when it's abused." That struck a chord. A subtle shift in posture rippled through the audience of young artists, journalists, and activists. Phones were discreetly raised, and someone was already live streaming the conversation. But Sandra didn't appreciate the answer. She jumped in before the moderator could pivot again. "Respectfully," she said with practiced calm, "you're making it sound like the industry is out to harm people. That's not true. It's complex, but it's fair most of the time. When artists struggle, it's often because they fail to adapt to the business." There it was, the assumption that Jimin had heard countless times before. He gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Most of the time," Jimin repeated, "but not always. I've seen young fans who weren't given a platform to express themselves because they didn't fit the image. I've seen creators who couldn't afford to pursue their dreams simply because they didn't have the resources." The audience shifted again, sensing the intensity. Jimin continued, "You think that's rare, but it's not. I've seen labels ignore talented artists because they didn't fit the mainstream mold. I've worked with fans who couldn't afford the price of a concert ticket but still found a way to support our music. This isn't just theory, this is lived experience. It's real." Sandra Maischberger narrowed her eyes. "Do you believe the entertainment system is unfair?" Jimin replied calmly, "I believe the system is only as fair as the people who control it. And I believe we pretend fairness exists, but we often don't practice it. The room quieted. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the overhead lights and the clicking of a camera in the back row. One person in the audience whispered, "She's not wrong." Someone else nodded. I've never heard anyone speak like that, especially not on live TV. Meanwhile, Sandra leaned back in her chair, crossing one leg over the other. She was calculating. Her reputation wasn't just built on sharpness, it was built on winning. She knew how to frame questions, how to unsettle people. But something about Jimin's presence was different. It wasn't that he came to win, it was that he came with nothing to prove. That calm certainty was harder to rattle than raw arrogance. The moderator tried again. "Jimin, are you suggesting the system is broken?" Jimin looked directly at him. "I'm saying the system was built by people, and like people, it reflects their biases, unless we make an active effort to change it." But Sandra wasn't about to let the conversation end there. Jimin didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a deep breath, his calm demeanor unwavering, before giving a faint nod, not of agreement, but of acknowledgement. It was the first visible shift in him since the conversation had begun. The moderator, sensing the tone had changed, leaned back in his chair. "We've discussed the impact of artists and their role in culture," he said. "But before we move on, is there anything else either of you would like to add?" Jimin looked over at Sandra Maischberger, then smiled softly. "I may not agree with everything you've said," Sandra said, her voice measured, "but you've earned your place here. That's clear." Jimin didn't gloat. Instead, he simply replied, "I appreciate that." While the live discussion continued, cameras outside the room were already telling a different story. Clips from the exchange were rapidly spreading across social media, and the world had a lot to say. By the time the panel ended and the audience began to leave the Windspear Opera House, Jimin's name was already trending online. Not for a flashy performance, but for the way he handled the pressure, for the rare moment when Sandra Maischberger herself had stepped back, not out of defeat, but respect. For many watching those clips now flooding platforms like X, formerly Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, one question kept coming up. Who is Jimin and where did he come from? To answer that, you'd have to go back a few years. Before BTS, before international fame, before global tours, you'd have to go back to a small dance studio in Busan, South Korea. It wasn't glamorous. It shared a wall with a laundromat and had a worn-out vending machine that ate more coins than it gave back. But for Jimin, that little studio was everything. It was where he learned to stay grounded in case, how to listen, and most importantly, how to fight for his dreams. His first major challenge wasn't one he chose. It came when he joined BTS, facing skepticism from those who doubted the group's success. No one believed a K-pop group could break into the international scene, but Jimin didn't listen. He spent hours perfecting his craft, not just dancing and singing, but learning to connect with the fans. And when BTS started to rise, it wasn't just the music that mattered. It was the message. Jimin became the kind of artist others leaned on, not because he was loud, but because he showed up every day, working tirelessly for the group and its fans. His journey wasn't easy. There were nights he spent practicing until exhaustion, and mornings he showed up to the stage with no sleep. The public didn't always see the hard work, but the fans knew, and that's what mattered. As BTS grew, so did Jimin's awareness of the issues he wanted to address. He began using his platform not just for music, but to stand up for mental health, LGBTQ+ rights, and education. He didn't look for headlines, he looked for ways to make an impact, to start conversations that could make a real difference in people's lives. But even in Washington, Jimin didn't let the spotlight soften his edge. When politicians tried to use his popularity for their own agendas, he stood firm. He remembered those early struggles, the challenges he faced in a small studio, and the battles to be heard. That's why when he faced off with Sandra Maischberger under the glare of live cameras, he didn't flinch. He'd faced tougher rooms with no applause, no microphone, just a stack of practice and his belief in the power of music and community. While Jimin's past told the story of his strength, the internet was just waking up to his present. What happened next sparked a national conversation far beyond that stage. By the following morning, clips from the panel had flooded every major platform. A 30-second video of Jimin calmly explaining his view on the role of music in society had already hit 3 million views. People weren't just sharing it, they were dissecting it. Some called it a turning point, others a fluke. But Sandra Maischberger wasn't ready to call it anything just yet, at least not publicly. Privately, however, she wasn't thrilled. In her dressing room, she was quiet, not angry, just reflective. For decades, she had built a reputation on always being the sharpest person in the room. No one interrupted her, no one outmaneuvered her. But Jimin's presence was different. The producers had invited both of them back for a brief post-panel discussion, meant to feel casual, off the cuff. But Sandra had no intention of being casual this time. She saw an opening and was determined to take it. The cameras rolled again in a smaller studio just down the hall. The setup was simple: 2 chairs, 1 camera, and a coffee table between them. Sandra looked over at Jimin. "We've talked about the influence of music, but let's shift," she said, her tone now more personal, a subtle challenge in her voice. "What's your view on the responsibility artists have in shaping culture? Because I see a lot of young artists today thinking passion can replace preparation." Jimin raised an eyebrow. "Are you asking if passion gets in the way of the work?" he asked. "I'm asking if it's professional," Sandra responded. "The stage isn't therapy, it's a place for artistry." Jimin nodded slightly. "It's not therapy," he agreed, "but it is human. Art is supposed to involve real people, not just performers. I've seen fans tear up when they hear our songs, but I've also seen them cry because they feel unheard. That's not just performance, that's connection." Sandra tilted her head. "You think emotion has a place on stage?" "I think truth has a place," Jimin said, his voice calm but firm. "And sometimes truth comes with emotion." Jimin didn't clap back right away. Instead, he took a quiet moment, his calm expression unshaken, before giving a slight nod, not of agreement, but of acknowledgement. It was the first visible shift in him since the conversation had begun. The moderator, sensing a change in the tone, leaned back in his chair. "We've discussed the influence of artists and their role in social movements," he said. "Before we move on, is there anything else either of you would like to add?" Jimin looked over at Sandra Maischberger, giving a soft smile. "I may not agree with everything you've said," Sandra said, her voice measured, "but you've earned your place here. That's clear." Jimin didn't gloat. Instead, he simply replied, "I appreciate that." While the live panel continued, the conversation took on a life of its own online. Clips from the exchange had already started circulating across social media, and the world had a lot to say. By the time the panel wrapped up and the crowd began to leave the studio, Jimin's name was trending, not for a dramatic performance, but for the way he handled the pressure, for the rare moment when Sandra Maischberger herself had stepped back, not out of defeat, but out of respect. For many watching those clips flooding platforms like Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, one question kept emerging: who is Jimin and where did he come from? To answer that, you'd have to go back a few years, before BTS, before world tours, before the global spotlight. You'd have to go back to a small dance studio in Busan, South Korea. It wasn't glamorous. It was tucked between businesses and had a cramped atmosphere. But for Jimin, that little studio was everything. It was where he learned to stay grounded amid chaos, how to truly listen, and most importantly, how to fight for his dreams. His first major challenge wasn't one he chose. It came when he joined BTS, facing skepticism from those who doubted the group's potential. But Jimin didn't listen. He spent countless hours perfecting his craft, dancing, singing, and connecting with the fans. When BTS started to rise, it wasn't just the music that mattered, it was the message. Jimin became the kind of leader others could rely on, not because he was loud, but because he worked tirelessly to stay authentic and true to the values he cared about. He spent long nights practicing and mornings arriving early to practice before anyone else. The public didn't always see the effort, but the fans did, and that's what mattered to Jimin. As BTS grew, so did his understanding of the issues he wanted to address. He began using his platform for more than just music, raising awareness for mental health, LGBTQ+ rights, and social justice. He didn't seek the spotlight. he sought to make a difference. He looked for patterns, noticing the struggles young people faced in communities around the world, and decided he wouldn't remain silent about it. Even in Washington, Jimin didn't let the spotlight soften his approach. When others tried to use his fame for their own agendas, he stood firm, always remembering where he came from and the struggles he faced early in his career. That's why, when he faced off with Sandra Maischberger under the spotlight, he didn't flinch. He'd faced tougher rooms with no applause, just his belief in the power of community and music. As the debate continued, Jimin's calm logic and measured responses began to capture the attention of the world. By the following morning, clips of the panel were everywhere. One particular video, a 30-second clip of Jimin discussing the importance of using art to drive social change, hit 3 million views in a few hours. People weren't just sharing it, they were analyzing it. Some saw it as a turning point, others as a fluke. But those who watched it closely saw something different. Jimin's ability to stay grounded, to deliver a message without yelling, but with such conviction. The conversation continued on platforms like TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube, where fans and critics alike shared their thoughts. Some said Jimin had just made a groundbreaking statement on how art and music can drive change. Others, like Sandra Maischberger, privately acknowledged that he had earned their respect. While the debate raged online, Jimin remained focused. He didn't post anything on social media, not out of strategy, but because he had a stack of emails from his fans to go through and a town hall meeting to attend the next day. But his silence only fueled the conversation. Teachers shared the video in classrooms. Law professors included it in their lectures. A local bar association in Arizona even invited him to speak at a conference titled Grace Under Fire, Speaking Truth Without a Mic. As for Sandra Maischberger, she responded not with a statement, but with a brief phone interview, where she said, "Jimin's grounded and he knows his case law better than most artists I've seen at his age. I challenged him because I challenge people who I think have something important to say. He didn't flinch. I respect that." The media ran with it, some framing it as Sandra softening or even endorsing Jimin. But for those who had watched the exchange, it didn't feel like surrender. It felt like a passing of the torch. One video, in particular, stood out from the rest. It was from a young woman sitting in the fourth row who had quietly recorded the exchange on her phone and uploaded it without any edits or captions. In the video, you could hear Jimin's calm, collected voice as the crowd listened, not to cheer or boo, but to understand. At the end, you could hear a voice near the camera, a woman in her late 50s whispering, "That boy's gonna change something." The comment section exploded. For the first time in a long time, a national debate about the role of art and public perception wasn't just about conflict or outrage. It was about someone demonstrating true expertise when it's earned, not handed to them. While the online world buzzed, Jimin stayed focused. 2 days after the panel aired, he was back in a modest community center in Duncanville, Texas, standing before a crowd of mostly teachers, retirees, and working-class folks. There were no cameras, no reporters, just a dry erase board that read, "Know Your Rights" in blue marker behind him. He barely mentioned the panel. It wasn't until a retired bus driver raised his hand during the Q&A that it even came up. "I saw you on that show with the TV host," he said, grinning. "You got her good." There was some scattered laughter, but Jimin smiled politely. "It wasn't about getting anyone," he replied. "It was about making sure the truth wasn't drowned out by authority." Then he moved on, updating the room on new community programs and answering questions about affordable housing. Jimin didn't respond right away. Instead, he paused, took a moment to reflect, then gave a small nod, not of agreement, but of acknowledgement. It was the first visible shift in him since the discussion had started. The moderator, sensing a change in the atmosphere, leaned back in his chair. "We've discussed the role of artists and their influence on society," he said. "But before we move on, is there anything else you'd like to add, Jimin?" Jimin glanced at Sandra Maischberger, his calm presence unshaken. "I may not agree with everything you've said," Sandra said, her tone calm but assertive. "But you've earned your place here. That's clear." Jimin didn't gloat. Instead, he smiled softly and replied, "I appreciate that." While the live panel continued, the discussion quickly gained traction outside the studio. Clips from the exchange were already making their way across social media, sparking conversations. By the time the panel wrapped up and the audience began to disperse, Jimin's name was already trending online, not because of any flashy performance, but because of the way he handled the pressure and the rare moment when Sandra Maischberger herself had stepped back, not out of defeat, but out of respect. For many watching those clips, now flooding platforms like Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, one question kept emerging. Who is Jimin and where did he come from? To answer that, you'd have to go back a few years, before BTS, before global fame, before sold-out arenas. You'd have to go back to a small dance studio in Busan, South Korea. It wasn't glamorous. It shared a wall with a laundromat, and the vending machine often ate more coins than it gave back. But for Jimin, that little studio was everything. It was where he learned to stay grounded in chaos, how to listen, and most importantly, how to fight for his dreams. His first major challenge wasn't one he chose. It came when he joined BTS, facing doubts from those who didn't believe a K-pop group could make it on the global stage. But Jimin didn't listen to the doubters. He spent countless hours perfecting his craft, dancing, singing, and finding ways to connect with fans from around the world. As BTS rose to global fame, it wasn't just the music that mattered, it was the message behind it. Jimin became the kind of artist others leaned on, not because he was loud, but because he worked tirelessly to stay authentic and true to the values that mattered most. He didn't seek fame, he sought change. He used his platform to raise awareness for mental health, social justice, and education. Even when he was invited to speak at various influential events in Washington, Jimin didn't let the spotlight soften his edge. He didn't let others use his fame for their agendas. He stayed true to the message he wanted to share. That's why, when he faced off with Sandra Maischberger under the live cameras, he didn't flinch. He'd faced tougher situations with no applause, just his belief in the power of art and community. The following morning, clips from the panel were everywhere. A 30-second video of Jimin calmly explaining the importance of artists using their platforms to amplify social issues quickly hit 3 million views. People weren't just sharing it, they were analyzing it. Some saw it as a turning point, others as just another moment in the spotlight. But for those who watched closely, it was Jimin's calm, collected delivery that stood out. He spoke with such clarity and purpose, something rare in a world full of noise. Even while the buzz around him grew, Jimin didn't change his pace. He wasn't interested in the hype. Instead of appearing on morning talk shows or chasing headlines, he chose to stay grounded. He continued with his commitment to grassroots work, speaking at local events and meeting with his fans, answering their questions and hearing their concerns. At a legal aid fundraiser in El Paso, Jimin spoke about his first experience with adversity, not as an artist, but as a person learning to navigate a world that wasn't always fair. He shared a story about a young fan whose dreams were crushed because of systemic barriers. But Jimin made sure to tell them that they didn't have to fight for their voice to be heard with anger. They just needed to speak the truth. Back in Dallas, local news caught wind of the viral moment and tracked down a few of Jimin's former fans for reaction pieces. Most declined, but one agreed to speak anonymously. "He got me through a tough time," the fan said. "I didn't think he even remembered me, but he looked me in the eye when no one else would." Meanwhile, Sandra Maischberger returned to her regular schedule, filming her new series. When asked by a producer how she felt about the media frenzy surrounding Jimin, she reportedly shrugged and said, "The world will see what Jimin's doing. If he keeps showing up, they'll get it." Jimin didn't need Sandra's blessing. He already had his community's trust. He had already been invited to give a guest lecture at Texas Southern's law school. When he arrived there a week later, he didn't talk about viral moments or media clips. Instead, he started with a lesson on legal basics, reminding students to stay true to their beliefs and show up for what they believe in, even when no one is watching. One final moment stood out. Nearly 2 weeks after the panel, Jimin received a handwritten letter from a civil rights attorney in Minnesota. The envelope was plain, no return address, but the message inside was clear. "You didn't come to perform, you came prepared." That's rare these days. Don't waste time proving yourself to those who've already decided you're not enough. Keep showing up. The world needs voices like yours. Jimin read the letter twice, then carefully slid it into the back of his notebook. He didn't need anyone's validation, because the real takeaway from everything that had happened, the viral moment, the applause, the media frenzy, was never about winning. It was about how you carry truth when the world expects something else. For Jimin, he had learned long before the cameras ever found him that you don't fight power with noise. You fight it with clarity, with calm, with repetition, and sometimes with silence that speaks louder than shouting. It wasn't about embarrassing anyone or going viral. It was about reminding people that art and truth belong to everyone. And that's the message Jimin continues to carry. He knows that the real authority doesn't need to shout, it just needs to show.